Greetings, friends. Umanske here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of May 13th through May 19th of 2024. And if you want to keep receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, and let's get right into it. So in this week, we actually have a lot of updates, and the Russian offensive in Kharkov is still continuing, and the Russians are still pushing well everywhere. So, let's go over what they happened. So one thing I want to mention about the Kharkov offensive is that in a video I made a few days ago, I talked about what we should expect about the Russian summer offensive. What should we, in terms of educated guesses based on inferences, based on what people have been saying, what should we expect? And a lot of people, I think, when the Kharkov offensive started last week, people kind of were overhyping it, and I was kind of, not on videos, but on like servers I'm in that talk about the Russian-Ukraine war. I was kind of saying, hey, we should kind of not be so dismissive of the Ukrainian defenses. A lot of people, because the Russians made a lot of rapid progress on the borderlands here, they thought that there was no defenses here, and that the Ukrainians were just collapsing. And it's like that people kind of jumped the gun a little bit here, because I mentioned this in my last weekly update, but the actual main first line of defense in Kharkov for the Ukrainians goes from Lipsy, Visola, kind of goes below these forests here, goes to Robotyne, and then goes to Volchansk. And as you can see, once the Russians reached the first line of defense, that's when they actually started getting real resistance from the Ukrainians. And now it's going to be a slow grind, just like anywhere else. It's not like, they're going to completely just smash through everything. The borderlands were kind of this gray zone anyway. And so now the Russians are battling for the first line of Ukrainian defense. But regardless of that, they are making good progress. Let's talk about it. So you could kind of divide it into two parts. They call it the Lipsy front and the Volchansk front, which is kind of the two main big towns that kind of link the first line of defense. Let's talk about Lipsy. So on this area last week, the Russians basically managed to clear the village of Luhanske here and the village of Globokka here. And Globokka was a bit of a hard fight because it was split by a river and actually has some few high-rise buildings, as you can see right here. So this was a pretty, the Ukrainians actually kind of gave a little bit of a fight here. They didn't just give it up pretty easily. However, the Russians managed to capture this town and managed to capture Luhansk, which is probably just a small little, actually it's not that small, but yeah, it's a small village, and actually managed to move through these fields and reach the outskirts of Lipsy. Now, the capture of these two villages basically was the last kind of roadblock before the Russians could start the battle for Lipsy. Lipsy is important because once the Russians capture Lipsy, this basically allows them, to put artillery here and actually start shelling at least the northern part of Kharkov with conventional artillery. And Lipsy is a big enough town where they can continue just kind of moving southwards and use this kind of forest and river as like a natural defense, and then, move all the way down until they reach what they call the Kharkov Ring Road. And this Kharkov Ring Road is what separates Kharkov city itself from like maybe the villages. And so, they might reach the, Ruskitishki, maybe Terzhnisky, and so kind of move all the way down. But as I mentioned last time, I don't think they're going to be going into Kharkov. They just don't have the troops for that. But again, it depends on what we expect from this Kharkov offensive. And for right now, if the goal is just simply to create a buffer zone and maybe support the Russians in the Kupiansk-Liman front by moving through eastern Kharkov, then they only need to, maybe take Lipsy, and that's really it. If they want to create a small little buffer zone, that's all they need to do. And a lot of rumors say that that's actually what they plan on doing, because they say the Russians are now accumulating in Sumy and in western Kharkov and are going to push there as well. If that's the case, then that's also that just kind of reinforces about the need to create a not for the dual purpose of spreading the Ukrainian reserves thin so that the Russians could actually push in their main objective, which is Donbass, and then also to create a buffer zone just to protect from Russian territory from being shelled. So, in terms of that's more limited objectives, but, the capture of Lipsy is absolutely essential to push the Ukrainians away from the Russian border here. Along with this, not only did they capture these the Russians capture these two towns, they actually managed to start attacking the Lipsy dachas, these dachas right here. And most sources have said actually most of these dachas have come under Russian control. And then a lot of sources are saying that the Russians, and we saw this from FPV drone videos, that the Ukrainians were droning Russian positions here. And so a lot of sources are saying the Russians managed to enter Lipsy from kind of this eastern position, but we don't have any geolocated footage of them inside the town yet. So the Battle of Lipsy has started, and we'll have to see how, if the Russians could break through here, because this is where the first line of Ukrainian defenses, and we'll have to see how strong the Ukrainian defenses here are. So it's going to be the real test of Ukrainian defenses. So the Battle of Lipsy has officially started this week. Let's go over to the second part, the Volchansk front, and this is where a lot of the main focus has been. The Battle of Volchansk this week has started, and this is probably where the fiercest fighting in the Kharkov offensive has started, because Volchansk is a big city. Last time I said there was only like 3,000 people here. I mistook it. I misread it as there's only 3,000 people that are left there. It had a pre-war population of like I think 20,000, 30. It's a big city. It's like as big as Avdiivka. So this is a big actual town. What happened this week? The Russians had basically captured northern Volchansk. Basically, the more where all the high-rise buildings are, where a lot of the biggest infrastructure is. Now so Volchansk can be divided into two. It's divided by a river, and the river kind of goes like this. And so there's southern Volchansk and northern Volchansk, and the Russians took northern Volchansk. Southern Volchansk is still safe because they have that river, and to cross a river it requires a little bit more effort. But what happened basically was that once the Russians secured, these border towns, they entered Volchansk from the north here, just did a direct assault, and so they managed to. They also attacked more to the east here, managed to take some land to this area, took the village of Tikiki, kind of took any village that kind of rested on the northern side of this river. And then once they secured their eastern flank, and then obviously they're pushing here and securing their western flank. When they secured their flanks along the river, they pushed through and managed to, they destroyed all these bridges, and they basically made life hell for the Ukrainians on the northern side of this river. And Volchansk, we see heavy street fighting. The Russians pushed in many directions. The main thrust of the attack was kind of along this highway down towards this central avenue of the high-rise buildings and this hospital. And a lot of sources are saying this is where the main Russian push was. And then more on the eastern side, the Ukrainians kind of got outflanked by the Russians. And so the Ukrainians, since it's more like residential areas, was not as secure as the more high-rise buildings are in the center of the town. And so because of that, this entire eastern section of Volchansk fell to the Russians, and so they fell back to the southern part here. Now, there's some places here that could support the Ukrainians in the south. For example, this this kind of factory and the train station. This is another area where the Ukrainians are kind of holding up. Another area that could help the Ukrainians is these high-rise buildings that are in the very south of Volchansk. And so, northern Volchansk was, it took a whole week of fighting, but most sources are now saying that everything above the Volchachka River is now under Russian control. It's been bloody fighting. It's like very heavy fighting. Glide bombs, drones, everything's just being burned to the ground. But the Russians finally took the northern part, and now it's just a question of how will they make a bridgehead? Where will they break through? And because they obviously want to take Volchansk, which is again the eastern linchpin of the first Ukrainian line defense in Kharkov. So, taking the northern part of Volchansk allows. It was actually was almost inevitable to be said. But now it's like southern Volchansk, which has this river. Will the Russians create a bridgehead? I'm just gonna. So it just depends, and we should expect Volchansk to Southern Volchansk to fall a little bit more slowly than the northern part, but it's going to probably fall eventually anyway. Along with this, on the western front, on the the western part, the Russians were battling here to secure the village of Burutkova and Starlivska here. These two villages, the capture of which basically secured the western flank so the Russians could actually continue their advance here. And the capture of these two villages allows basically the Russians could continue moving, they could either continue moving south to take the village of Ibadiska here and Ternona, and to kind of link up these two separate fronts, or they could then make a small river crossing here and use this forest as cover and start cutting off southern Volchansk from the south here. They could start battling for Selinovka, Liman, these villages right here, and kind of cut off the supply routes, to Volchansk, or at least one of the main ones. And this will be hectic, and this could lead to the rapid fall of Volchansk. So, but they had to secure these to not only to secure the offensive into Volchansk, the main offensive into Volchansk, but now that these two villages have been taken, not only does that expand the buffer zone for the Russians, they also will allow them to start putting stress on the Ukrainian defenses in Volchansk. So that's the Kharkov offensive. I still think that the main purpose here is to draw Ukrainian reserves here, and also to create a buffer zone, and at the very most, probably try to support a Russian offensive in the Oskol front, the Kupiansk-Liman front. So yeah, speaking of the Kupiansk-Liman front, let's talk about what happened in that area this week. So early, in April, we're talking about the capture of Klishivka and Klotorovka, and the Russians have secured themselves in these two villages. But now they're focusing on another area in the south here. The Russians have kind of managed to expand southwards, expanded from the village of Krylovnina, and managed to enter the first street of Berestova. Now, the village has not fallen yet, but if the Russians are already on the first streets, I wouldn't be surprised if Berestova falls probably by the end of this week for sure. But the capture of Berestova, again, is another village that helps further, secure Russian positions in their attempt to kind of reach the Oskol River. And taking Berestova would also not only put off pressure from Novoselivska, which was captured last year by the Russians. It will then allow them to have this kind of northern place under wraps, and then they could start moving southwards along the Zhierbets River and start taking these three villages, Andriivka, Misorivka, and Stelimivka. And these are kind of more, this not only, again, furthers their progress towards the Oskol River, it also takes more, it allows them to take the step forward towards taking back all of the Luhansk Oblast, which is kind of a bit of a thorn in Russian side, because tactically it might not make much difference. I mean, a little bit, but it's more of like, the Russians are in control of like 99% of Luhansk, and Ukraine's still in control of 1%. And the fact that it's not completely under Russian control is a bit of annoying for the Russians. And we also could see the focus on taking these three villages, not only in their attacks towards Berestova, but also because some rumors are saying that the Russians managed to advance all the way up to the village of Misorivka here, and managed to take it, and now to split this defense in two. We don't have any confirmation of that, but we'll have to see next week if that is true, because if it is true, this small little village did fall, and Berestova is right now getting stormed, then, we could definitely see Stelimivka be attacked from two sides and fall very quickly. So, again, and then, if we look what's happening here, if these three villages fall, and this is the new front line, then there's, again, just open fields for the most part until the Oskol River. Same thing here. Once they take Klishivka and Andriivka, they're gonna probably start focusing on Ivanivka and Novoselivka here. So let's take it from a kind of a big picture perspective what's happening here. So if the Russians do everything they want, this is going to be the front line. So, it might not expand the front line a bit, it pushes a little forward, but again, once these kind of forward villages, which are holding the Russians back are taken. These are like forward defense lines. If these fall, then there's nothing except 1 or 2 villages, but besides that, it's just fields until the Oska River. Now that's gonna it's not easy as I say because it's fields and it's gonna be a lot. Moving through fields is very suicidal, but that again, this pushes the main Ukrainian defense line all the way to the villages that lay along the Oska River. Instead of right now, the Ukrainians had positions that held the Russians back from the Oska River. So the Russians are pushing to push the main Ukrainian defense line to the Oska River instead of it being near Swatovo. So it's a bit of a tug-of-war game. No change on the Liman front or the Seversk front. Actually, there has been a little bit of a change on the Seversk front. Some sources are saying the Russians actually managed to enter the first streets of Bilogorivka. This is good news for the Russians. The thing is, this village is completely burned to the ground. There's really nothing left of it. And also, the main heights are in this sand chalk quarry and the hills to the west of Bilogorivka. So even if the Russians take the village itself, again, they need to take the heights. Now, if they take Bilogorivka, they could maybe do a pincer attack and take the sand chalk quarry, which could, secure their gains. And again, this is another village that's in the Luhansk Oblast that the Russians want to take back. So again, for propaganda purposes, it could be good, but just taking the village itself is not enough. They need to take one of these dominant heights in the area. But it's worth noting that they're finally entering the village. On the Chasiv Yar front, we actually have a lot of progress. So on the northern sector, the Russians managed to break through, basically enter the first streets of Kalinova and take the trenches that are in front of it. And this has been in tandem with, as the Russians are trying to expand their northern pincer and enter this forest to the north of the canal zone. Because the southern part of the canal zone has been fully taken by the Russians, and now they are just waiting for the northern canal zone to be taken. And because they took that, by the end of this week, the Russians launched a full-scale offensive, according to the Ukrainians, into the canal zone. The Ukrainians released the videos which showed Russian troops entering this area and kind of moving along this area and capturing entering a huge chunk of this area. The Ukrainians said, they got completely destroyed and there's nothing left, they got pushed back. That might be the case, but we have to, we don't know exactly yet. We have to wait for more confirmation on what's the stitch on the extent of that. How much did the Russians manage to secure before the Ukrainians made a counterattack to push them out? But according to the video, we saw the Russians entered and managed to capture kind of the more eastern part of this canal. And if the Russians manage to hold positions here, then this canal zone's already fucked. It's going to be taken, and the Ukrainians will have to get back behind the Svetsky Donetsk canal. So the Russians are putting pressure on the north here, trying to push into Kalinova and clear this forest to the north. The Russians are storming this canal, which is being bombed to smithereens. One of the main goals of the Russian Donbass offensive is going to be to take Chasiv Yar, because it's on the height, and it'll basically give the Russians a dominant position. As I mentioned, where the Russians want to focus for the summer offensive. If Chasiv Yar falls, not only will they be able to put dominant pressure on the main Ukrainian defense line, Slovyansk Toretsk, they could then move, to the, if there is a push in the Kupiansk Liman front, they could cut off Seversk. They could then also cut off Toretsk if they manage to break through here from the Avdiivka direction. So Chasiv Yar is a linchpin in Ukrainian defenses here. Or at least not a linchpin. It gives the Russians a position to have a lot of opportunities to break the Ukrainian defenses a lot easier in Donbass. So Chasiv Yar is a very big focal point. And right now the battle is to take the canal zone or the canal district and reach the Svetsky Donetsk canal. Also in this area, a lot of sources are saying the Russians are now battling in Klishevka. A lot of, this map doesn't show it, but a lot of sources are saying the Russians are in the center of Klishevka battling for the ruins of this village, which again has been razed to the ground. I think this is more of an opportunity push. I think the Ukrainians are moving troops from southern Chasiv Yar front to Chasiv Yar itself to try to hold the line here. And the Russians are opportunistically trying to take it. But again, in order to actually take Klishevka, they have to take the dominant heights here, which is This area, this area. They have some heights here, but again, they need, taking the lower ground, Klishevka is, will be very hard to hold unless they take the heights here. So, but I think this is just another pressure point and just opportunistically trying to take reverse the Ukrainian gains from the summer 2023 offensive. So we'll have to follow that pretty closely. Because again, if they want to storm Chasiv Yar, they'll have to also secure their flanks a little bit here. And I think at the very least, they need to reach the canal here. And then they could start encircling Chasiv Yar proper, not just the canal from the south here. In order to do that, they need to take Klishevka and Andriivka. On the Pokrovsk front, or the Avdiivka front, we actually have a lot of interesting updates here. So it's been a bit of a right now in the northern part of the sector. I could kind of summarize it as flattening the front line. There hasn't been any big changes on the front. The Russians flattened the defenses between, in Arkhangelsk and the fields on the outskirts of Nova Alexandrovka here. They managed to solidify, they're in between Selinova and Sokol. The Ukrainian defenses are in Sokol, the Russians are in Orcheshiny and Selinova, and their battles are between the trenches between these two villages. But they managed to flatten the front line a little bit, and the Russians managed to also flatten the front here a little bit. They pushed out of Berdichi and Senidivka and secured one or two tree lines here to kind of put pressure off of these villages. But kind of one of the main areas where is the southern Pokrovsk front here. So, and this is where it's interesting. So today we basically got confirmation, not today, but this week, we basically got confirmation that the entire village of Umanske has fallen to the Russians. Oh, that's raining outside. Sweet. Anyway, so all of Umanske has fallen to the Russians. And we just need confirmation of the more western part here, but basically all of Umanske, for the most part, all of Umanske has fallen to the Russians. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, so they captured Umanske, and not only that, they managed to capture fully the village of Netailove, which was a big surprise to me. I thought, they were going to battle for the center of Netailove forever like they did Peremyska, but not so. And I thought that, in order to take Netailove, they'll have to take this area. And while they did finally cut off the main supply routes, roads that took into Netailove, that was almost after they finally broke through the center and managed to reach the western outskirts of Netailove. And so now again, we're waiting for confirmation for the last village of buildings here. But again, if the Russians have taken all this, then they have taken this, and the Ukrainians have fallen back to Karlovka. And again, this whole area, again, the whole reason why the Russians are pushing here is to reach the Volchansk River Reservoir and push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. And in order to do that, I said they need to take Umanske, Yasnobronovka, and Netailove. And Netailove has fallen, Umanske has fallen, and basically now, and the Russians are now going to clear up everything up to this river. And so I wouldn't, now it's just kind of cleanup operation time. The Russians are going to kind of expand their little, zone of control of Umanske here, and then the gray zone will be the villages between the Ukrainian defenses of Novoselivka, Pershi, and Umanske. They'll take Yasnobronovka, and then Karlovka will be the next defense for the Ukrainians as well. And so this will be where the Russians they're going to do some clear up actions. This is going to be pretty simple to take. So we'll see how, the Umanske and Netailove were the Ukrainians were trying to hold that area to try to, continuously hold the Russians back, but Umanske and Netailove falling basically secures the fate, and the Ukrainians will have to retreat to the Volchansk River. But once the Russians do the clear-up actions here, I expect the offensive here to stop, and I do expect the Russians to continue pushing to the north here, but in terms of the south here, I think once they reach the Volchansk River, that will be the end of that. And then the Russians are going to focus to the north, and then maybe start hoping to cut off Nivolska here. This week we saw the Russians continue clearing the fields between Peremyska and Nivolska, and I wouldn't be surprised if also the Russians will focus on clearing the fields south of Netailove and kind of use this kind of ravine as a defense line here. And they're going to probably try to storm the Volska again and kind of have something like this, and then have the fields be the no man's land for example. So yeah, the Pokrovsk front is kind of stabilizing, but the Russians are still pushing here. On the kind of more southern part of the kind of in the Donetsk front here, in Krasnogorivka, the Russians are managed to capture a few tree lines to the north here to expand their positions in this area. Right now, the clashes are still going on for this hospital and trying to encircle the Ukrainians that are in these high-rise buildings. And also, the Russians are trying to clear these other business districts here, and I don't think they're fully secure just yet. They are being cleared, and it takes a long time to clear these high-rise buildings. They are doing it slowly, step by step, but the Russians are still making progress. But there's still some work that needs to be done. But once they clear that up, then the Krasnogorivka will fall. It's just a bunch of residential areas, which can be taken pretty quickly. But right now, the Russians are just trying to clear, those business districts, with these kind of more two-story buildings here, and then also try to take this hospital to put these high-rise buildings in the on the east of Krasnogorivka into a pincer, have it collapse, and then then the front line will kind of go like this, and then if these get cleared up, the front line will go like this, and then it's just residential areas. So Krasnogorivka is slowly but surely being cut into pieces. And then we also have a lot of sources are saying that the village of Grigorivka, the center of it has fallen, that only the western outskirts remains to the Ukrainians. This came to a surprise for me. I thought they would, try to, once they were doing Krasnogorivka, and they were going to have to secure maybe the, try to cut off it from the north here. But somehow I think the Ukrainians gave up. Maybe they're like, yeah, fuck this, we're not going to hold this any longer. We're going to retreat to Maskulinovka here. Maybe to reserve for troops. Maybe they just this was a hasty update. Maybe the Ukrainians are still in the center, but right now most sources are saying the center of Grigorivka has fallen to the Russians, and this is just another step for the Russians to push the Ukrainians towards the away from the Donets and towards the Volchansk River. So I do believe that right they're going to continue focusing Krasnogorivka, and the front line will go something like. Yeah, well, they're going to try to clear it. So they're going to, something like this maybe. And kind of the Ukrainians will have Maskulinovka and Hostra as kind of these outposts here. But I expect the Russians to not try to start battling for Maskulinovka, or at least try to storm it and take it until they take Krasnogorivka. They might try to take maybe the eastern outskirts here, but just get a foothold here. But we'll see. I think they're going to focus on clearing Krasnogorivka, because this is the last town on the 2014 defense line that the Ukrainians have to shell Donetsk, and they don't want to lose it. The Ukrainians tried to do a counterattack in Pobeba, but it got repelled, so there's no changes on the front line here. A lot of sources are saying the Russians are trying to break into Pereskolovka, but we don't have any firm confirmation on how much of this village is under Russian or Ukrainian control. So we'll have to wait to see the fog war clear up and see what this village's true status is. And Perestroivka needs to be taken in order to continue putting pressure on Konstantinivka from the north. And yeah, so again, they need to redo what they did in Novomikhailivka. They needed to go through the fields in the north and south, and just slowly pincer Konstantinivka here. No real changes on the Ugledar or this front. There's clashes, but nothing too big. On the Zaporozhye front, however, we actually have a lot of updates. And basically the update here is that the village of Robotyne has fully fallen to the Russians. This was the only gain the Ukrainians had during the 2023 offensive, and now it's completely taken. We saw confirmation of Russian flags being flown on the northern outskirts of Robotyne, and so now the Ukrainians are kind of falling back to the outskirts here. And so the capture of Robotyne is a bit of a morale crusher for the Ukrainians. This was the only gains they had for 2023, and now it's being reversed. The Ukrainians also lost a bunch of positions between Robotyne, or between Novopokrovka and Verbova. Once the Ukrainians took Robotyne, they kind of focused on Verbova, and they tried to nudge their way. They kind of nudged their way right here. And now the Russians are clearing this they try to dug themselves into cut off Verbova and Novopokrovka, but that got completely reversed, and now these two villages are more, the front line's far away from them, and now the battle is going to be to push the Ukrainians away from Robotyne and back to their starting positions in Mala Takhmachka and Novodolinovka. So, again, the quest to flatten this front line, it continues for the Russians. And no changes on the Kherson front. So yeah, that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed the updates that happened this week. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, comment your thoughts, and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.